So my name is Marissa, and the research that I'm doing right now is with pre-service teachers, and it's kind of around eco-justice and social justice work. So my partner, who is actually also teaching Greer, Dr. Burrows, her and I bring students to places. We've brought them to Greece in the past and Ecuador, and we provide sort of these experiences where they engage with local people and they work around different issues that are happening locally, social and environmental issues, and they learn from locals. And then we come back to New Jersey and we work then with in-service teachers and try to develop lessons around social and eco-justice for kind of K-8, now kind of K-12 classrooms. So we're looking at kind of transformation that pre-service teachers have through participation in this, and then also kind of the types of learning that young people can do when you have teachers with this kind of orientation. So today, what I want to share a little bit about is my work that I did during my dissertation, which is pretty aligned in many ways theoretically to the work that I do now, but some of the methods that I used then are a little bit different. So when I was doing my dissertation work, I was working in New York City and I was a classroom teacher. And so I was really interested in using visual and spatial methods to think about how young people that live in urban communities think about their environments. Environmental education, a lot of it was from perspectives of kind of like nature and suburban, like outside urban communities. And I was really interested in how young people in the city were experiencing their local environments. And so a big part of that was having them take pictures of places that had meaning to them, taking pictures in their neighborhoods, in their homes, and then sort of attaching meaning to those places. And another method that I used was place mapping and other kind of spatial mapping stuff, where I would have students collage and make either any kind of visual representation of their neighborhood and use kind of symbols to represent different things that had meaning. And then I used those to elicit sort of conversation that they could then have about similarities and differences across experiences of young people in a place like New York City. I was really drawn to spatial and visual methods for this work. And I really did, just to say, like, piece together a lot of different methodologies in certain ways. So I was using something called photo voice, which is a kind of critical methodology that's linked to participatory action research in communities. And I was also doing a lot of work that came out of critical geography. And so I was kind of playing with a lot of different methods to put my research together. And I was really interested in the experience of young people in place. And my students came from all these different parts of New York City. And what we were trying to sort of name was what were the kind of forces that were happening to them across different neighborhoods in New York City. And so looking at primarily gentrification was probably the biggest issue that came up, but looking at how gentrification was impacting kids in the Bronx versus kids in Astoria and Queens versus kids in Brooklyn versus kids in Manhattan, it was really interesting to see how spatially that those kind of relationships young people had. And then my high school was actually located in Manhattan. So students had a lot of ideas about what it meant to go to school in Manhattan. And they placed this kind of bigger value on Manhattan as a place. And this brought up then issues of like identity and commodification and your identity as a consumer and a citizen. And so I was really interested in kind of relationship to place and also meaning, like the way we make meaning of places. So spatial felt like it would capture the geographic aspect as well as kind of the narrative and meaning making aspect. So when I say visual spatial, it can be lots of different things. So spatial like can be anything from like in the kind of world of geography, I think about it. But the way I was thinking a lot about it was meaning making of place. So it could have been anything as literal as a map. Students would draw the roads, the Grand Concourse in the Bronx, and then highlight a corner and say, this is the corner where I always get a little bit nervous when I walk by. And so things like that. So it was as specific as that, but it was also things like, like one girl did the fire hydrant in her housing community and talked about that hydrant and the meaning that like the hydrant it was less about kind of where it was located, but more about the community that was created around the fire hydrant. So in certain cases, it was very specific to kind of geographic location, but in other places, it was much more about issues of like safety and kinds of emotional and behaviors that they associated with certain feelings of either safety or comfort or belonging. Limitations and challenges. I think probably first and foremost, I think a lot of people probably don't think in terms of spatial analysis and thinking about how people move and use space as kind of an indicator. And I think this is kind of true even in schools. Like there's a lot of great work that's done around critical geography in schools and how school space is used. And so I think a lot about that. But and you know, to be honest, I think limitations are really like maybe what you make of them in this, because my limitations in this were like that it was almost like too much data. It was too much like stuff that kept building on each other. So we would do photos and then we would do narratives and then we would do the maps, and it just kept building. And I did this like over kind of 3 years of my work. And so the amount of data can really get very big. So then you end up having to really select pieces of it, and so maybe you're then obscuring certain parts, and I know that's sort of true for all of them, but this did feel like, you know, hard to represent all the voices of the young people that I was working with, and so I think that's probably one of the limitations of it. um, but I think again you have to kind of be drawn to this kind of work. I think it's a little out of the box, and I think it's a little, like I said, I really pieced a lot of it together based on methods that I was really drawn to, because and a lot of my work actually stems from my own relationships with place and my own learning in place. And so this was always a really deeply kind of important thing to me, to think about how my neighborhood growing up shaped me, and then how neighborhoods and communities are shaping the young people that I work with, and trying to create a space in school to let them explore that. And that part of the research was like very challenging too, was doing any kind of school-based research that's really critical at that. You know, in New York City, there was that kind of benefit of like, I could close the door to my room and, you know, people wouldn't come looking, but it does feel like doing any kind of more subversive or critical research right now might be really challenging. So. Yeah. So I think what's interesting is that the method itself inherently doesn't have to be critical, right? Like you don't have to add this layer of critical reflection and analysis onto it. So I think, you know, you can do, you know, relatively innocuous studies around space and how kids move through space. I think if you're going to do any kind of work that goes deeper into like criticality and identity, especially working with young people, I think you yourself have to do a lot of work. And again, said I was doing this for 3 years. It was not till like the third year that I was doing it that I even felt like that I was even decent at it, you know, because there was so much learning I had to do and so much listening I had to do and so much messiness in my classroom that I had to really learn to be okay with. Because if I really was truly committed to letting my students really uncover their experiences in place, I had to really step away, because I didn't grow up as a kid in New York City. And, you know, as an adult in New York City, I could see the forces that were affecting me, but it was really different than getting kids into classrooms and schools and trying to learn what their experiences were of getting there. So, yeah, so I think just doing any kind of critical work, it's emotional work. It's, I think, the most rewarding kind of work that you can do, but I do think it's energy intensive in a lot of ways, and it's not embraced. And students are a little resistant in the sense that schools never looked like that before. And so those are just some of the my personal kind of hurdles. And I don't know if they're inherent in the methodology itself, but I think it's just in any kind of really committed, critical, actionable research, you know, that's going to be part of what you have to manage.